Welcome to today's Batchelor Society, and today we're going to be talking about The Five, the untold lives of the women killed by Jack the Ripper by Hayley Rubenbold. Published in 2019, it was shortlisted for the Wolfson History Prize in 2020 and won the Baillie Gifford Prize in 2019. Unlike last year's first Batchelor Society, in which Jacob Rees-Moggs's book on the Victorians was destroyed with facts by Mr. Weston, this talk will be more positive in its view of the book.
The most consulted file in the National Archives is the Jack the Ripper dossier. A lot of work has been undertaken, which most of the activities of serial killers who became known as Jack the Ripper have been mostly investigated by ripperologists, who searched the records of the 1800s to find tiny fragments that support their preconceived theories as to who Jack the Ripper was. The Ripper murders, I know as many of you know, have been an enigma since as far back as the Victorians. The mystery surrounding this identity of this infamous London serial murderer have become as complex as the murders themselves. After interviewing over 2,000 people, investigating 300 and detaining 80 others, the London police were still dumbfounded as to the real identity or identities behind all these murders. During the course of their investigation, however, police narrowed down the suspects to several men. However, none were formally charged.
Hayley Rubenbold is not the first professional historian to approach the Ripper story. Philip Sugden, who wrote The Complete History of Jack the Ripper in 1994, set the standard for a very long time. But Rubenbold is the first to concentrate slowly on the lives of the five canonical victims, who we are as sure as can be possible, were all killed by the same violent misogynist. There are obviously other killings that are ascribed to Jack the Ripper, which just shows the frequency of femicide in Whitechapel at the time, but these are the five generally accepted victims of his that have been talked about the most in history. Her approach has caused massive divisions within the ripperologist community, and many traditionalists feel that she misses the mark with her work and its female focus. Myself and Miss Robinson picked up the book on a recommendation and thoroughly enjoyed it and wanted to share our thoughts on it with you. Rubenbold questions that everything we'd ever come to assume about these five women was largely untrue. What if our general lack of understanding of how poor working class women lived or how respectable society viewed them has led us to believe that all of these women were just prostitutes, and that somehow this label has made their lives less worthy of exploration or commemoration? What if we learned that none of them were born in Whitechapel or even in the East End, but ended up there after living full lives elsewhere? What if we learned that these women had been either wives or mothers or both? What would we think of ourselves and our society for never having questioned these things?
The Five has completely changed the narrative of the Ripper murders by placing the women in the heart of the story, investigating the women's experiences. It traces the surprising triumphs and heartbreaking difficulties that they encountered throughout their lives. It aims to challenge the notion that the women were all solely prostitutes. Rather, it was only two of them, Elizabeth Stride and Mary Jane Kelly. Each section of the book narrates the full and complete lives of the five victims. This book allows us to consider a new approach to the victims of Jack. From the stories, it will be impossible for us to ever again see them as something other than daughters, wives, sisters, lovers and mothers, or to remember them simply as nameless, faceless victims.
So the first victim was Mary Ann, or Polly Nichols as she was known. Hayley Rubenbold recounts Polly's steady childhood as the daughter of a blacksmith and discusses her love story with sweetheart William and the support he provided to her family after the death of her mother. Her descent into poverty was brought about through the actions of her husband and his numerous affairs with their next-door neighbour, which ultimately forced her from the marital home and left her in need of a man to financially support her, as was the norm in Victorian England. It was unfortunate in that the men that she chose drew her into the underworld of London, Whitechapel specifically, placing her in the Ripper's path through no fault of her own.
The second victim, Annie Chapman, very similar to Nichols, she had a very happy childhood. She was brought up in a loving household with parents who weren't necessarily expected to have stayed together. Although she experienced the tragedy of losing siblings through typical Victorian diseases, she, much like Polly, had a very happy marriage and 3 children of her own. It can be argued that her personal struggle forced her into Whitechapel and into the clutches of the Ripper. Through no fault of her own, Annie turned to alcohol as a source of comfort during these difficult times of the loss of her family. This in turn resulted in her leaving the family home, as she had brought embarrassment upon her husband and his employer. It is worth noting that her husband did try and help. However, given the family situation and understanding in the Victoria era, this was not successful.
Next up, we have Elizabeth Stride. So, born in 1843 in Sweden, she would seem an unlikely victim of an East London serial killer. She came to London in the service of a foreign gentleman, but it is likely that a misinformed perception of her as a prostitute followed her to London, which stemmed from her time living in Sweden with an unmarried man. She made a safe choice in her husband John Stride, and they owned a small coffee shop together in Poplar. Following the death of her father-in-law, the will left the couple destitute, as her husband was ignored for the most part, and the marriage broke down, so with no money left for the coffee shop, they had to sell it. Her newly single status took her to Whitechapel, where she was taken under the wing of Mrs. Malcolm, a local seamstress, which allowed her to maintain a roof over her head, supported alongside the small allowance her husband was giving her. Lodgers described her as a quiet woman who would do a good turn for anyone. However, she had frequently appeared before the Thames Magistrate Court on charge of being drunk and disorderly, sometimes with obscene language. The death of her husband in 1884 led to the loss of her income and exacerbated her addiction to alcohol. It was as her life spiraled out of control and the increased severity of her syphilis symptoms that she began to spend more time on the streets of Whitechapel, where she did earn money as a prostitute. But Rubenbold argues it is more likely that she was targeted by the Ripper because she was sleeping rough and therefore people were less likely to notice she was missing.
So the fourth victim, Catherine Eddowes. She was the daughter of a tin maker. Her father and brother left their jobs in Wolverhampton during the Tin Men strike around 1848, and the family walked to London. Her family was poor. However, through a local charity, Catherine was offered a place in a prestigious school where for her it would have been an honour coming from a working class family to go to. She would have the opportunity to attend the Great Exhibition as a 9-year-old. Both her parents died when she was young, and she went to live with her aunt in Wolverhampton. Her older siblings believed that as Kate had the better education, she would not have to join her younger siblings as orphans in the local workhouse. She later took up a job in a domestic service. She meets an Irish soldier called Thomas Conway as a young woman, and she was swept up in the romance of it. Her family didn't like him, and even less so when she became pregnant. They made a good partnership, as Kate's education made her a helpful voice to Thomas when making business decisions in his job as a chapman. She followed him around the country, helping to sell his chapbooks, and they were able to make a good living, though nothing exceptional. In 1868, she returned to London looking to settle and bring up an end to her and her husband's nomadic lifestyle. Thomas's living began to dry up as he competed with more people in London, and they lost a child due to malnutrition. Thomas resumed travelling around the country while Kate struggled to make ends meet. She and Thomas had never actually married, so she was lumped in with those known as fallen women and prostitutes. She was still able to ensure that her children were educated, but she began to experience violence at the hands of Thomas. Her relatives came to the conclusion that she was bringing it upon herself, a common perception at the time. Kate turned to alcohol as a result, which only worsened perceptions of her, as she was arrested several times for being drunk and disorderly. Eventually, she was able to leave her husband, but had to fend for herself. This, like the preceding victims, led to her relying on kindness of other men. This was to be the end for Kate, as she found herself in the middle of Whitechapel, in the middle of a killing spree.
Last up, we have Mary Jane Kelly, who is the second of the two victims who Rubenhold does acknowledge could be called a prostitute. Little is known about her early life, as she told many versions of the story to many different people. One version stated that she was born in Limerick in Ireland, but moved to Wales with her family as a child. Others stated she was born in Wales and abandoned by her parents, who still lived in Cardiff. The main source of Mary's life is her lover at the time of her death, Joseph Barnett, whose account is garbled at best. Those that knew her remarked on her high level of education and scholarship. She also claimed to have been married at 16 and to have had a child before she died, but again, these are difficult to prove. She arrived in London in 1883-1884, where her story is much more followable. She was a prostitute, but would have worked for a procuress who would have ensured she met with a higher class of clientele, in the West End of London usually. She claimed that one man took her to Paris, though this may have been with more nefarious intentions as part of a trafficking operation. Prostitution helped Mary Jane Kelly to keep a roof over her head, though it seems she had begun to tire of it and was looking to do other things away from the trade, and moved in with Joseph Barnett on Miller's Court. Many women living there were feeling increasingly vulnerable as news of Jack the Ripper's killings spread throughout the East End, and Kelly took in another woman to live with her and had fallen out with Barnett as well. Her neighbour heard her with a man on the night of her death in her room at Miller Court, and the rest, as they say, is history.
So, as Reuben Hall puts it, the cards were stacked against Polly, Annie, Elizabeth, Kate, and Mary Jane from the day of their births. They began their lives in deficit. Not only were most of them born into working class families, but they were born female. Reuben Hall also ends the book with a list of objects and possessions found with each woman at the time of death, which gives us a final glimpse of their lives as normal women in the wrong place at the wrong time. As you can see, each of these women had their own stories prior to their unfortunate encounters with Jack the Ripper, turning them into nameless victims. Their lives were not and should not be defined by their deaths, and the idea that they were just prostitutes is wholeheartedly shown to be a misguided assumption through this book. The overriding message seems to us to be the idea that everybody has a story that is worth telling, and that evidence should always outweigh assumption and opinion, which may be rooted in a much too narrow understanding of the world. Just because the idea that all the Ripper's victims were prostitutes has been the dominant argument for so long, it doesn't mean this is the right one. As teachers of history, we think that this is crucial for people of all ages, especially students, to understand.
By placing working class women at the centre of the narrative, Five also makes a significant contribution to gender history and women's studies. In the current climate, with calls for teaching a more diverse curriculum, this can also mean increasing the number of female voices within a historical period as well. Although we do still remain focused on their deaths and the link with Jack the Ripper in the book, the stories of each of these women provide us with a snapshot of life in Victorian England, and arguably 19th century Sweden too. These snapshots allow us to further explore Victorian jobs, living conditions, interactions between men and women, lawmaking, crime and punishment, and addiction from a different point of view to traditional male-led narratives. As the Victorians is an often taught topic in the history at all levels, both of us would want to see how we could utilise the contents of the Five beyond the story of Jack the Ripper.
Some of you may know that we now teach about the story of Jack the Ripper in Upper 3. Within those lessons, students also have to use evidence from a variety of sources to identify who they believe that Jack the Ripper was, and forming a compelling argument to support their choice. Each of the 5 victims are named and a little information is given about each one, but the focus is primarily on Jack. Going forward, me and Miss Farrington, we would like to see how we could present the stories of the 5 women to students and see if that actually affects their perception and or understanding of who the Ripper might be.
Overall, The Five by Hayley Rubenhold makes a key contribution to historiography in a wide variety of areas. The Victorians, Ripperology, crime and punishment, the lives of women, views on sex and sexuality, etc., etc. Although it has proved to be a divisive book amongst those interested in the subject, this very division shows why it was necessary to write it in the first place. Both of us would wholeheartedly recommend this book to you and would love to talk about your thoughts on it too if you have already read it. Thank you for listening, and if you do have any questions, you can pop them in the chat.